All right, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to PapersWeLove. Thanks to the organizers for having me. So tonight, I'm going to be talking to you about a paper by Leslie Lamport. It's called Time, Clocks, and the Ordering of Events in the Distributed System. So this is a short paper, but it's super dense, and it covers a lot of academic and intellectual ground. It's got state machines and scheduling algorithms and sort of analysis on clock drifts. And because this is a lightning talk, we're just going to focus on the first 3 pages here to get our bearings about some things in distributed systems. And for the next few minutes, I want to think about sort of one motivating question, which is, how do we know the order of 2 events? And we can think about this question in a couple of contexts. So first, we can think about this in a single process, where a priori we know where everything is, everything that's happening. But also, if my slides come back, voila, magic. We can also think about this in a distributed system where we don't necessarily know everything and where we have to communicate between processes to figure out what's going on. So to do that, I'd like to start out with a bit of a motivating example. So let's get right in. If my slides will move forward, ta-da, welcome to middle school. So I hope you'll indulge me in the next few minutes in my side hustle as a YA novelist, where we have our 2 characters, Ben and Sarah. Ben and Sarah are 7th graders. And at the start of the day, they walk into homeroom and they decide to have a competition during the school day. So what's the competition? Well, whoever gets 2 text messages from 2 different friends and then tells the other person about it first wins. This is sort of a weird game, so maybe you'll ask some questions like, in the event of a classroom with bad cell phone service, is there an arbitration process? Or why are Ben and Sarah playing such a contrived game for my dystopian talk about distributed systems? Or importantly, do middle schoolers still text anymore? These are the big questions, and I hope you'll think about them. So let's dive into it. So let's check in on Sarah. So what does Sarah do? Sarah leaves homeroom, and she goes to her first period science class. And you can see on the board she already has 1 message. Barely an hour into her day, and she's already halfway to victory. She goes to her second period English class. She gets another message. Ta-da! Great. She's won. She whips out her phone to text Ben. Ben's an Android user. That's a whole other talk for a whole other meetup. And she sends a message to Ben, and it looks like Sarah won. Great. So we're done. I think I'm about 2.5 minutes in this talk. But hold on, because while we were following Sarah, Ben has also been playing this game, right? Ben got his 2 messages, and then he sent a message off to Sarah. And after he sent that message to Sarah, he received something from Sarah. So what's going on here, right? This should raise a question, which is, can either Sarah or Ben prove that they were the winner of this game? So let's think about this for a second. What's going on? So what were the rules of the game? The rules of the game were whoever told the other person about it first would be the winner. We didn't say anything about timestamps. We didn't say that they would put their phones next to each other at the end of the game and see who the winner was. Those weren't necessarily the conditions we cared about. So the question becomes, now we're going to get to the paper, can we use this theory from Lamport to help us understand what's going on here and shed some light on this topic? So I want to introduce the paper. So this is the paper. It's got that nice, beautiful, academic 2-column font. If you squint a little bit, you can see the abstract. Maybe there's a picture there. And I want to call your attention to this picture because what is this picture? It's a process diagram, and it looks a little bit familiar, right? We've been talking about Ben and Sarah, and they've been sort of sending text messages back and forth to each other. But in some other conception, right, they're processes, and they have events on those processes. And they send messages back and forth. So maybe we can use some of the theory from Lamport to sort of help see whether or not Sarah Ben has a claim to social victory. So to do that, I want to talk about 2 concepts. First, I want to talk about partial ordering. So what is this? Well, it helps us answer a question, did one event happen before the other? And if that is the case, if we have 2 events, A and B, and A happens before B, then we say that they're partially ordered. And in the literature, we say that they have the happened before relationship. And this is something that you see in Lamport, as well as the distributed systems literature more broadly. So we have 2 events, A and B. A could have happened before B. B could have happened before A. But this is a partial ordering. So there's a third option, right? A and B could be concurrent. They could happen at the same time. And what does this mean? Well, it means maybe with the information we have, we don't quite know what's going on. Maybe they could have happened in one order, maybe the other, but we just sort of accept that, well, there's some universe in which they're basically ordered in the same way. So with what we have, it's impossible to know. So how do we implement this? 3 rules. First rule, in a single process. So in a single process, from Lamport, a priori, we know that we can sort of see everything being totally ordered. We have total knowledge of everything that's going on. So as new events come in, the events that we've seen before on our process happened before the new events. Ordering number 2, message transmission. So in Lamport's world, all communication is asynchronous. What does this mean? Well, it means that there's some non-zero amount of time between when we send a message and when we receive it. So we can view actually those two things as separate events, right? Sending a message happens before receiving a message. And we can see this when Sarah texts Ben. Sarah sends it, Ben receives it. Sarah's sending happens before. And then rule number 3 is transitivity. So this helps us with how do we answer, a relationship between events that aren't necessarily immediately proximate. So let's look at an example. Sarah gets a message. Sarah sends a message to Ben. Ben receives it. Ben receives another message. We have a relationship of partial ordering between these two events, even though there's a lot going on between them. So that's concept number 1, partial ordering. Concept number 2, logical clocks. So what's this? Well, this is a function. And when I say logical clocks here, I really want to sort of draw your attention to that first word, because I want to divorce this concept of logical clocks from what you might consider physical clocks, physics, chemistry, any of those other like traditional understandings of time. So our logical clock is just a function. On its domain, I think it takes events, and on its range, it assigns out timestamps. So those timestamps could be natural numbers, they could be the reals, they could be anything that we can assess a total ordering over. And it goes up arbitrarily. So when we have a logical clock, we don't really have units of time, right? You don't measure a logical clock in seconds or hours. They can also be thought of as counters, but when you have a counter, you keep going up. And in a distributed system, if you want to implement logical clocks, every process is going to hold its own clock. And it's going to hold a clock for only the events on that process, and that clock determines the time of the event for all processes. So if there's an event on my process, my clock gets to assign the time to that. If there's an event on your process or someone else's process, that clock gets to assign the timestamp. So how do we do this? Well, much like with partial ordering, we have to figure out what to do in a single process. So here we have an event, we give it some arbitrary time. We have a new event, we give it another time. So here we increase the time by 2, but we could have just as easily increased it by 2,000, 2 million, 2 trillion. As we said before, the thing about logical clocks is that their rate of increase is arbitrary. It doesn't necessarily matter how far up we go, so long as we keep going up. Logical clocks number 2, message transmission. So how do we change our timestamps if we're getting a message from another process? So the first thing you'll notice here is that when we send a message, we're also putting the timestamp onto that message, right? So we say, hello world, we say whatever we want, and we also say, this message is sent at some time. So when you receive the message, you take that receive timestamp, and you also take the most recent timestamp that you have, and you take the greatest one. And why you do this? Well, you can read about it in a little bit more detail in the paper, but basically the conceit here is that time has to, relentlessly keep marching on, right? You have to keep going into the future, and that's why you add 1 at the end, right? Is you have to keep going up. Whenever you get a new higher timestamp, you have to account that into your local clock. So those are our 2 concepts. We have partial ordering, we have logical clocks. How do we put them together? We've seen a lot of similar things, right? We have a single process, we have message transmission. Is there some way that maybe we can relate these 2 things in a notion that's helpful? So the first thing is that if 2 events are partially ordered, then their logical clocks are also ordered, right? So if A happened before B, we can see that on this process, the event on the left happens before the event on the right. The clock time of the event on the left is less than that on the right. So this is great, super, hopefully straightforward. But it's not true that the converse holds. So why is this? If we have 2 events and they're, they have the same, if they're concurrent, then this means that all events that are concurrent would have the same clock time. And Lamport goes into more detail with a very good example in the paper of why this is true, but it doesn't hold, right? Like we can't say anything about clock times necessarily leading to a relationship, if we don't know anything about how the clocks are consistent, right? In our distributed system, each process is maintaining its own clock, and it's not necessarily checking in with the center with this some sort of central authority to say that like its clock is right. It's maintaining its own clock under its rules, and therefore we can't actually use logical clocks in a distributed system like this one, much as we might like to. So we have partial ordering, but we don't necessarily have logical clocks here. So can we use this to sort of arbitrate our social game? So let's look at Sarah. Well, these are Sarah's events. She gets her 2 messages. She sends a message to Ben. We can follow this with this sort of like red arrow of transitivity. Hopefully, it should just follow that we have, the 2 events on a single process, and then we send a message. So those events are all ordered with our partial ordering. But the same thing is true with Ben, right? So Ben also has his 2 messages, and then he sends a message off to Sarah. So how do we reconcile these 2 things? It's kind of a mess in the middle here. And unfortunately, the depressing kicker of this talk is that when 2 messages cross in the event stream, we actually can't say anything about which one came first. Kind of a bummer for Ben and Sarah in that their game was a little bit underspecified. And Lamport sort of acknowledges this, right? This is a quote from the paper. We use any arbitrary total ordering of the processes. He sort of just like throws his hands up and says, well, I guess you can just pick one, I guess. Not super helpful for us, but because Ben and Sarah are 12-year-olds, I'm sure they'll have no problem coming up with an arbitrary ranking of the 2 of them. So not super great for Ben and Sarah. But could they solve this, right? What could they do to maybe make their game a little bit more well-formed next time? What are the options here? And I don't have a ton of time, so I just want to sort of like briefly highlight some of the broad categories here. So 1, they could rely on a central authority. So whether it's a trusted friend, a teacher, whatever, a 3-node zookeeper cluster, whatever you want to do, they could rely on something that makes them have a central set of timestamps. And then option number 2, you could remember every possible permutation of events. And this is something that you see sort of more in the academic world and less in practice. And this is something that comes out of a paper by a guy named Colin Fidge 10 years later in Response, where you basically just send an array of all of the timestamps back and forth as you're sending your messages between processes. So that's what I've got. Hopefully you've learned something about partial ordering. I'd like to thank you for listening. Thanks to PapersWeLove for having me. Thanks to Andy for walking me through this and shepherding me to where we are today. And hope you enjoy Elijah's talk. Thanks. I don't know if we're doing questions. Yes, no. I make no promises. No. No. 1.
So how in practice would you sync with the central authority? Because isn't that going to be asynchronous too and just going to introduce the same problem over again?
Yeah, so Lamport goes into this more in the paper, and I invite you to look at that. He actually does say that there are some problems with centralized scheduling authorities, and that's you make further assumptions about message reliability and things like that. Basically, the short answer is it's hard. Cool. Awesome.
All right. Thank you very much, Dan.